I think what has happened today has been in some ways very interesting. It's a very different environment for me to be in, to be perfectly honest. I think there's been issues, discussions that I can see in certain ways have overlapped very interestingly with what I find is interesting, or the way in which I work on stuff I work on. And there's been other parts where I sort of think I live on a different conceptual planet. So join me on this expedition to my conceptual planet here, and see what you can make of that planet and its environment. So I'll begin. I'll use my famous 5 minutes of fame to just briefly talk a little bit about where my paper is coming from. I work at the University of Roskilde, which is a university just outside Copenhagen. It's a cultural studies post-colonial outfit, and my background is post-colonial studies. So what I've been doing over the last sort of few years is moving away from Anglophone post-colonial studies, as we call it these days, because of its history, and into something which is a combination of something you could call post-colonial Europe, and in a regional perspective, the post-colonial Nordic, and in a national context, post-colonial Denmark. And if I start with post-colonial Denmark, of course, that's where I'm coming to Greenland from in my paper here. So I'll get to that when I get to the paper. I won't say much about post-colonial Europe. I have certain things I could say about it, but I don't think I'll talk about that today. Other than sort of say, well, obviously post-colonial Europe can also accommodate Britain. This is something sometimes you need to say to the Anglophone part of post-colonial studies, rather than saying that it's the only part of post-colonial studies there are. In the post-colonial Nordic, I'm sort of just referencing a couple of sort of things in progress and things that have been published, because it's where work has been coming out, I suppose, from me and from a group of colleagues working in the Nordic countries. So last year we published a book called Whiteness and Postcolonialism in the Nordic region, which very specifically focused on migration as colonial legacy. I mean, not colonial legacy in the British or the French sense or Portuguese sense, where it's about migrants coming from the former colonies and settling in those countries, but where the colonial archive nonetheless plays a role in the ways in which migrants are received in the Nordic countries, who, bar a couple of exceptions, one of them Denmark, of course, didn't actually have colonies. And then currently I'm working with some of those people from the first book on a book that's sort of at the moment called something like Globalizing the Nordic, where we're looking at it through the intersection of three crises, and we're looking at the crisis of the economy or financial crisis. We're looking upon it at sort of a crisis of the environment, of which climate change is, of course, one of them, and then of course the crisis of multiculturalism. And what we're interested in is really the intersection between these three types of crises. And then finally, perhaps I should just mention that I'm also part of a HERA project from the EU, which just received funding, which Graham Hagen at Leeds University is in charge of, called Arctic Encounters. And the Roskilde project under that is called Greening Greenland, Climate Change, Ecotourism, Indigenous Tourism and Political Change. So you can see at least that what I'm saying here is at a certain level relevant to the theme of the workshop here, even if it is in some ways also very, very different. So why is Greenland interesting to me? Well, it's interesting to me because it is an emerging post-colonial nation. It is also interesting to me because it is a liminal south-north space in the extreme north, a frontier location of the consequences of climate change. So that's the sort of preface to the paper itself. Okay, typically when you present a paper for a workshop or conference, you begin by situating what you analyze within the broader framework of a range of theories and approaches. This time I've opted for a bottom-up approach, so I'll begin with Greenland and finish up with addressing how it can be situated inside a range of overlapping critical interventions, which I'm loosely defining here as decolonial studies, postcolonial studies, whiteness studies, and critical race studies. However, before embarking upon my project, a few observations about my reasons for this approach may be useful. I will freely admit that part of my rationale behind my choice is a general tiredness in repeating the discursive vocab that is the list of influential studies that ground whatever theory has been chosen. Linked to my tiredness is an uneasiness about the sense of pouring theory over Greenland. The same goes for to be very concrete, there is no critical race studies environment in Greenland. The same goes for decolonial studies, postcolonial studies, and whiteness studies. I'm not saying that in Greenland there are not people who think along those lines, but the language of theory wouldn't mean much to them, except perhaps to a handful of people at Ilisummattuusapik University or the University of Greenland, since the language presumes a certain level of mastering a particular academic discourse. My train of thought here follows Gramsci's point that every man is a philosopher. My point is not to say attack the workshop title with its discursive title, nor the fact that we are meeting under its umbrella. What disturbs me is that at least I am, and possibly others will be, talking about situations far removed from the academic environment inside which we work. While this in some ways is the nature of our academic practice, I find it important for my own work to address it. This begins with the recognition that I am acutely aware of being yet another trainer speaking supposedly with authority on Greenland, which raises the question of what kind of post-colonial or decolonial performance I think I am enacting here. These opening observations are pivotal to my approach here, because rather than stating them as an initial claim, I will try to let them haunt my paper as a productive way of engaging with hugely complex issues that pertain to Greenland's position as a paradoxically emerging agent and object of the neoliberal hunt for resources in ever more remote locations on the planet. Remote here obviously refers to perception linked to normativity. Which normativity depends on the frame, whether it is neoliberalism or whether it is the aftermath of colonialism. Either way, it produces Greenland as periphery. While Greenland can hardly be remote to itself, it inhabits a position inscribed as remote by the powerhouses of neoliberalism and as periphery in its post-colonial relationship to Denmark, where colonialism still casts a really long shadow, for instance through the production of science about Greenland, political administrative culture, public management, etc., all of which is either managed by Danes or the structures of this type of management in Greenland are Danish in the way in which they were built up. So again, here we have colonialism. However, remoteness in the sense of being beyond the geopolitical horizon or beyond the reaches of the circulation of capitalism can be easily challenged. Toxic waste from the American East Coast has long been polluting the waters around Greenland. Pregnant women have, for example, been warned against eating traditional food sources due to accumulated toxins in the food chain. So my argument here is that remoteness is not a condition. It is produced by power relations over which locals have little control. I'm also arguing that if power relations aren't central, then remoteness is an uninteresting concept that merely refers to conceptualizations of distance as difference. For example, neoliberalism or the market produces as remote those places ripe for resource extraction, which have been beyond its grasp, but which are now brought into the circle of exploitation through, for example, technological innovations, or through the elevated prices caused by the exhaustion of resources closer to the market center. Resource extraction should be understood broadly here. It can refer to mining, that is mineral resource extraction in Greenland, or to textile factories, of course here, labor or human resource extraction in Bangladesh. Far more can be said about this, for example, of how Denmark produces Greenland as remote, but precisely in order to reinscribe it into a Danish-defined circuit. But I'm now going to turn the academic bucket upside down. To initialize my localization approach, I've identified 4 different takes on what I see as central discursive formations in extremely contemporary Greenland. I do this because I see them as interlinked, and in that way I hope they will shed light on each other and will help me present a few pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that is Greenland coming to terms with its own globality as a possibly emerging post-colonial nation. The introductory nature of the takes serves two purposes. They present my own early stages in grounding my own project, which is a project that I'm embarking upon now because we just received the funding from HERA, etc., etc. And the second point is they present to outsiders a way to begin to conceive of contemporary Greenland. And here, of course, I'm assuming you're all outsiders to that project, which you may not be. Okay, so the first out of 4 takes. Take 1. Sarah Gaveron's documentary The Village at the End of the World is a portrait of a small village threatened by closure due to the Greenlandic government's practice of deeming villages of less than 50 people unsustainable. In this film, anxiety when one of the leading figures of the village goes hunting across the ice is not just the usual anxiety pertaining to hunting as part of a localized risk society. I am placing Beck's terminology in the inverted commas here, which I usually refer for Eurocentrically conceived terminology. The contemporary risk connected to hunting in this part of Greenland is related to the unpredictability of the ice due to global warming. The documentary also follows the recent arrival of cruise tourism in a small village, which has led to an extremely modest cottage industry. Also there, remoteness is a theme, but interestingly through the perspective of the locals who are busily preparing for the arrival of the ship. The ship is seen as part of a cluster of activities that will entice the locals to stay, and some of those who have left to return. Remoteness is produced through contact between locals and cruise passengers, asking incredulously where the local restaurant is. Obviously there isn't one. And most embarrassingly, in the interview with cruise passengers who are completely infatuated with this place that hasn't changed for hundreds of years, but will probably now be changed. The camera then pans from the cruise passengers to a small child sitting with her laptop on the steps outside a house. An added layer to this incident is the clearly identifiable Danish accent of the cruise passengers, which then returns us to the timeless, happily embraced Danish stereotype of producing authoritative statements about Greenlanders, since we, of course, are always in the know. Take 2. Since I handed in my abstract to this workshop, important developments have taken place in Greenland in the political domain. The Greenlandic Self-Government went to the polls on March 15, and one of the most hotly contested issues was the large-scale law, which is to work as a platform to regulate the massive investments in Greenland, particularly in mining. The ruling party, IA, a party locating itself to the left of Labour, whatever Labour means in the bankrupt political systems of the West, lost the election to Siumut, which is the corresponding terms of a party of the Social Democrats or Labour Party. IA lost primarily because they were conceived as being too far removed from the Greenlandic people, too academic, and because it was felt a large-scale law could be implemented that would better protect Greenland's economic interests against international mining giants. IA, the former ruling party, favoured a tax on the profit. Siumut argued that royalties better ensured a return because taxable profits would disappear in transactions between mother companies and subsidiary companies in legalized tax fraud economies such as the Bahamas. Whether one works better than the other is actually extremely difficult to predict, but what it does show is that Greenland knows what it's up against, and therefore it is pivotal to the self-government that aligns itself with technically well-informed advice, but where from? What bodies can we conceive of that would be neutral arbiters when we're looking at, on the one side, a community of 56,000 people in total, and on the other side, mining companies which, with turnovers bigger than nations, far bigger than Greenland. The annual budget of Greenland, by the way, is less than €1 billion. Take 3. On election eve, Danish television, which is in this case the correspondence of the Danish BBC, or the Danish equivalent of BBC, shifted a couple of their primetime television programs to Greenland. A first, since traditionally Greenlandic elections have attracted little attention in Denmark. This time they centered Greenland on the verge of a mining boom, and hence in a position from which it might become increasingly independent of the annual Danish transfer of sums to boost the budget. brought a focus on Greenland, in fact relatively independent on the Danish discourse on Greenland. I should also say that it was the first election after Greenland was given autonomy or granted autonomy in 2009. The program, The Debate, a current affairs show, featured a debate first between leading Greenlandic politicians and then 2 Danish politicians, and finally all of them. Deadline, another debate program, featured a debate between the Danish, between a Danish politician and one of the 2 Greenlandic members of the Danish parliament. In each of these programs, the large-scale law and the presumed emergent mining boom was the center of the talk. Here is the presentation of the frame of the program on the website, with the title, Greenland at the Crossroads, and I'm quoting now. The changes in Greenland are so dramatic that some people think a new era is about to begin. This also means that politicians up to the election are facing acute dilemmas. And then some more text, and the end of the online presentation goes like this. Greenland is fighting unemployment, an aging population, and economic problems. Every politician agrees that the resource adventure can save Greenland and the Greenlanders, but the question is how. Unquote. Let's just briefly examine the assumptions of the platform behind the program, which of course is Danish. I mean, the assumption and the platform. If Greenland is facing a new era based on a massive intervention from outside, it is not the first time. The arrival of colonialism in 1721 is one obvious historical place to begin. The arrival of postcolonialism, at least in the sense of the abolition of Greenland's colonial status in 1953, is a more contemporary, hence more immediately comparable memory or moment to that's sort of more similar to the contemporary development, obviously because it's closer to our own present time. In fact, the presentation of the enticing and threatening new era is deeply reminiscent of the Danish modernization program initiated with Greenlanders as passive bystanders in the 1950s. So, in terms of the large-scale intervention from abroad, this is, being the first, this obviously is an ahistorical representation. Conveniently so, because it obliterates in the process Denmark as the orchestrator of the previous forms of Greenland's modernizations. What is new about the emergent situation is the fact that this time the Greenlanders are in charge, albeit within the very significant limits of a neoliberal order that even in much more solidly founded states in Europe have led to debilitating cuts to social welfare. I travel quite often to southern Europe. I know in this case what I'm talking about. What is also interesting when juxtaposing the opening statement with the finishing lines of the presentation, online presentation, is that where the opening smacks of a completely new situation for an emerging economy, the last part speaks to Westerners only too familiar language of aging population, unemployment, and the ills of overconsumption in affluent societies. In other words, the first part introduces Greenland on the brink of being discovered by the market, while the concluding lines speak of it as already of the West. Take 4. The large-scale mining project, which has received most attention for a number of reasons, is London Mining, which seems, and I'm saying seems here because every time you go to the website to track who actually owns them, somebody else pops up, so it's very difficult to know. But anyway, it seems to be controlled mainly by multinational transatlantic capital. The main thrust of their investment is directed at developing an iron ore mine, which entails the recruitment of 2,000 workers or more from China. Why from China? I thought, well, first there was a negotiation between them and a Chinese company, which I thought that must have been a reason, but then actually that hasn't really eventuated into something, so it's still owned by this transatlantic company, but they're still talking about the Chinese workers, which leaves one option, of course, for explanation, that is that they get the Chinese workers because they're a lot cheaper. Anyway, this has triggered, this possible introduction of Chinese laborers, has triggered anxiety in Denmark, which becomes relevant here since Danish immigration laws also apply to Greenland. Therefore, an exemption will have to be made, which again brings up the ghost of anti-immigration even if it has been usually directed in the last couple of decades in Denmark against Muslims, like just about anywhere else in the Western world. In Greenland, it has raised anxieties also, but of a different order. It's raised anxieties about foreign labour undercutting local labour, although it has to be added that not many Greenlanders are obviously trained for this kind of work. Remember that you were talking about a population of 56,000, spread over an island that's about 2 million square kilometers. Yes. The discourse in Greenland is largely about the not unrealistic scenario of the profits and labour accompanying the potential mining boom completely bypassing the Greenlanders. Also, of course, anxieties about how to accommodate 2,000 workers in small community-based Greenland. A second mining company, aptly named General Minerals and Energy, features a map of Greenland as a logo on its website. It is, however, based in Perth, Western Australia. Greenland Minerals and Energy, based in Perth, present their story as follows. I quote, "The company's primary focus has been on advancing the Kvanefjeld multi-element project, which is looking for rare earth elements, uranium, zinc, etc., through the feasibility phase and into mine development. In early 2007, at the point of acquisition, Kvanefjeld was known to represent a historic uranium project, and the known resources did not comply with internationally recognized reporting requirements. By late 2007, after the first drill program and resource estimate produced by GMEL, this is the company abbreviation for it, the acronym, it was clear that Kvanefjeld had the potential to become a resource of genuine global significance, and importantly, it also demonstrated that Kvanefjeld was a polymetallic deposit being strongly enriched in rare earth elements as well as uranium," unquote. Part of the problem with GME, this company, is that Greenland has a non-nuclear proliferation policy, and that the extraction of the rare earth elements is in fact not possible without extracting uranium, which furthermore exists in a quantity that makes it commercially interesting. Then there is, of course, the pollution issue. The mine is near one of Greenland's fjords. GME, in its listing of senior staff, board and key personnel, lists not a single Greenlander. So Greenland is reduced to the logo. Finally then, the theories. These 4 takes, although not taken at random, do not make up the whole picture. But what do they say about Greenland's moment of transformation in relation to fields such as whiteness studies, postcolonial studies, decolonial studies, and critical race studies, inside which I would eventually situate my approach? To begin with, the documentary, it shows a village incomprehensibly far removed from the main circuits of global traffic, but it also shows a village acutely aware of what it takes to restore life to a faltering community. In particular, in its main story about a boy who has Facebook friends from all over the world, who leaves for a bigger town to pursue his education. It shows racial stereotypes in the Danish and other cruise passengers' attitudes to the locals, more generally, but it also shows a community with a certain degree of agency. The Greenlandic political system is entering a phase of increased autonomy vis-à-vis Denmark, something which would have been unthinkable without the presence of resources. Trying to attract mining companies, rather than mining companies elbowing their way in, is one indication of where the Greenlandic preference lies. Political independence cannot exist where there is no economic independence. And political independence is the overwhelming project of both the former and the current government. Yet one can ask whether in the neoliberal system of dismantling the power of states, other than as local managers of the neoliberal system, Greenland might be backing, if not the wrong horse, then at the wrong time. But again, what options does Greenland have? Which brings me to the question of racism and the environment. Surely, in the account above, globalization with all its trimmings of capitalism is potentially profoundly destructive Greenland, the melting of the ice cap, opening of waterways without adequate protection against pollution, resource extraction. I have spoken here only of minerals, but what of oil, the difficulties generally of exercising sovereignty in all spheres of control of this small community. Yet it is also potentially profoundly emancipatory. In terms of the political, of course, from Denmark, developing its own position on what it means culturally to be Greenlandic, material well-being, improved infrastructure, better connecting dots along the Greenlandic coastline, and so forth. The Greenlandic go-ahead to mining will, one can argue, contribute actively to the rapid expansion of greenhouse gas emission. This will affect significantly small communities, I've only got a few lines left, along the Greenlandic coast, but they will they not be abandoned anyway? And will the locals, if they stay on, not develop alternative ways of dealing with it because they will have the resources to do so? In terms of the bind between racism and climate change, which I certainly acknowledge, in the complex realities of the neoliberal order, ironically, the Bangladeshis will be the ones to suffer because of the Greenlanders' transformation of their environment to emancipate themselves from the remaining part of the colonial shadow. Yet the Greenlanders can hardly be understood to be the instigators of this enormous change produced by the resources they're sitting on. This is the complexity we have to deal with, which I think is why Greenland is such an immensely interesting example, and I can't wait to get further into this project. Thank you.